After studying this module, you shall be able to know what courage is, how to develop and become courageous, identify the components and types of courage and ways to measure courage, evaluate the relationship between fear and courage, and also see gender differences that exist for courage. Defining courage. Woodard in 2004 defined courage as the ability to act for a meaningful, that is, a noble, good or practical cause, despite experiencing the fear associated with perceived threat exceeding the available resources. A more recent definition is given by Snyder in 2005, wherein courage is defined as responding to extraordinary times with behaviors that seem natural and called for in those circumstances. It is only later, when removed from courage eliciting events, that the protagonist and others view the behaviors as particularly worthy of the label courageous. This view of courage obviously gives greater weight to situational than to personal factors and suggests that most people are capable of courage if faced with the appropriate circumstances. Shelp in 1984 defined courage as: courage is the disposition to voluntarily act, perhaps fearfully, in dangerous circumstances where the relevant risks are reasonably appraised in an effort to obtain or preserve some perceived good for oneself or others, recognizing the desired perceived good may not be realized. Another definition given by Cicero as summarized by Hauser in 2002, which sees courage as the magnificence, the planning and execution of great and expansive projects by putting forth ample and splendid effort of mind, confidence that through which and great and honorable projects the mind self-confidently collects itself with sure hope, patience, the voluntary and lengthy endurance of arduous and difficult things, whether the case be honorable or useful, and perseverance, ongoing persistence in a well-considered plan. Components of courage. Raitt, Clark, Lindsay and Sternberg identified components of courage as intentionality, deliberation, personal risk to the actor, noble or a good cause, and perhaps fear. Currently, there appears to be a consensus that courage requires the element of intentionality. The actor must have an awareness and understanding of the presented occasion for courageous action and voluntarily decide to act. It also requires a worthy goal deemed so by merit of that goal's moral, noble or otherwise good value, typically from the perspective of the actor. Finally, the actor must perceive the occasion for courage as potentially personally threatening and the outcome must not be certain. There is no courage where personal safety is assured, but it is here that a secondary or parallel role of fear becomes relevant. Personal risk and uncertainty may or may not induce the emotional response of fear depending on factors such as training, familiarity, and confidence. While this added emotion would be expected to emerge from personal threat and uncertain outcome, some authors believe that acting under these conditions constitutes courage with or without the presence of fear. Shelp in 1984 indicated 4 components of courage. The first is free choice to accept or not to accept the consequences of acting. Next, a risk or danger. Next, a worthy end, and finally, an uncertainty of outcome. He indicated that it is not necessarily important to fear less to be courageous, but this individual would respect fear. Types of courage. Scholars have deliberated upon various kinds of courage. Courage can be bifurcated into many types. However, the most common division has been with respect to moral courage and physical courage. O'Brien, Lopez, and Peterson in 2000 elaborated upon three types of courage as physical, moral, and vital. Physical courage involves the attempted maintenance of societal good by the expression of physical behavior grounded in the pursuit of socially valued goals. It usually involves taking risks for a goal. It allows us to risk discomfort, injury, and pain. An example would be the courage that a firefighter has, or the courage to take on with your enemy. Moral courage is the behavioral expression of authenticity in the face of discomfort of dissension, disapproval, or rejection. Therefore, standing up for moral good against all odds. It involves doing the right thing even if it involves high amount of inconvenience or discomfort to present life circumstances. Choosing between alternatives and making good decisions that are morally correct and are in tandem with our ideals is what reflects moral courage. Examples of some people who showed immense moral courage and chose to do things in the right way are Mahatma Gandhi, Mother Teresa, and Martin Luther King. Moral courage involves actions toward preservation of justice and service for the common good. John F. Kennedy, in his compilation Profiles in Courage, gave more attention to moral courage than to physical courage. Moral courage also can be shown when we act with sensitivities towards people that are underprivileged economically, socially, or physically. Vital courage refers to the perseverance through a disease or disability even when the outcome is ambiguous. This term was coined by Finfield, before which it was referred to as health or change. It is the capacity to be able to withstand and be resilient in the face of physical illness. Vital courage is only shown when one is faced with disabilities and diseases, especially chronic diseases that are there to stay. How an individual fights and takes these debilitating conditions as a part of life and learn to be optimistic represents vital courage. Vital courage is also shown by family, friends, and hospital care providers like nurses and doctors who are treating patients with illnesses. Another related construct is of psychological courage that involves risking one's psychological status quo while achieving desirable goals. As put forth by Putman in 1997, it is the strength in facing one's destructive habits. It is the courage that is shown when one is dealing with situations that are stressful, requires choosing between alternatives, facing psychological challenges and difficulties. Therefore, psychological courage is exhibited when one faces such conditions and emerges triumphant and is able to make wise decisions and correct our belief systems. Another classification over the types of courage was given by Peterson and Seligman in 2004 in their Values in Action classification that conceptualized courage as a core human virtue comprised of such strengths as valor, that is, taking physical, intellectual, and emotional stances in the face of danger; authenticity, that is, representing oneself to others and the self in a sincere fashion; Enthusiasm or zest, that is, thriving or having a sense of vitality in a challenging situation, and industry or perseverance, that is, undertaking tasks and challenges and finishing them. Woodard and Puri found individual differences in courage based on a combination of the context and the goal of action. The four contexts include work courage, that is, courageous actions taken in the context of one's career or other major personal goal. Belief-based courage, the courage to stand up for one's religious or political beliefs. Social courage, the courage to take a moral stand for specific others despite social pressure. And family courage or courageous actions in the context of familial or other close relationships. Measuring courage. As there are individual differences in the presence and strength of courage, it becomes necessary to measure courage. A common man's perspective on courage usually involves a mention to physical and mental strength, the capacity to take risks in uncertain situations. It has both attitudinal and behavioral components. Courage scales that have emerged have mostly found to be self-report multi-item questionnaires. The Values in Action questionnaire measures courage across 4 dimensions of bravery, perseverance, integrity, and vitality. Woodard in 2004 developed a courage scale by administering a pool of 108 situation-based questions to 200 participants. Based on his definition, as mentioned earlier, he calculated a courage score by multiplying the rating of the participants' willingness to act in the situation by the participants' fear rating. This method ensured that fear as part of participants' courage and discounted the participant who was willing as the fearful participant but with lessened levels of fear. Puri, Kowalski and Spearman in 2007 gave open-ended questions on courage to 250 participants. Findings suggested that actions considered courageous compared to the individual's typical actions or personal courage might alternatively be thought of as fearful courage. On the other hand, actions considered courageous compared with the way most people typically act or general courage might be considered with the concept of fearless or confident courage. Such a reference-based conceptualization of courage as a construct, perhaps being modified by fear-reducing familiarity, ignorance, or training, explains how what is courageous for one person may or may not be courageous for another. The courage scale developed by Woodard in 2004 measures courage as the product of the willingness to take action and the fear expressed while taking the action. This scale puts forth certain hypothetical situations wherein the person chooses to agree or disagree with the behaviors that are given as responses to situations. Recent findings suggest that fear may not necessarily be a part of courageous action. Items for the original courage scale were reanalyzed using only the willingness top act scores. A 4-factor structure, work or employment, patriotic religion-based belief system, specific social moral and independent courage or family-based was found. This factor solution was replicated in a slightly revised version of the scale administered to a new participant sample. Interpretations of these factors suggested that courage may be classified by more complex context-based situations. A revised version of this scale, the Woodard-Puri Courage Scale 23, is included for further research and investigation. As the construct of courage is still in its infancy, There are not many scales developed to measure this construct. Also, due to differing dimensions being proposed for courage, there are complications with the measurement of this psychological strength. Gender differences in courage. Mostly men outnumber women in public awards for bravery. Becker and Eagly found that slightly more women than men undertook other heroic actions like saving Jewish people from the Holocaust, becoming living organ donors, and volunteering for dangerous overseas work. They explained these differences in terms of male role construction, emotional control, and situational requirements for physical speed and power present in male-dominated situations, and empathetic concern and relational construal present in situations with greater gender balance. Developing and inculcating courage. As this quality is highly required by one and all in all professions and in all walks of life, it is of vital importance to be able to develop this character strength. Following are a few ways in which one can choose to evolve as a courageous individual. Getting ready for action. Many a times there are situations wherein an individual is faced with circumstances that evoke fear. Then is the time when it is crucial for this individual to muster all courage and be able to overcome the feeling of fear and choose to act the way it is required and desirable. Being true to one's actions. In such situations, an individual might feel torn apart in choosing between alternatives. But it is of utmost importance that the individual must choose to act in a way in which he or she is truthful to oneself and what one actually desires. It is only under such circumstances that an individual will be called courageous. Passion is what that will drive one towards the desirable. Therefore, fear and courage coexist. Perseverance. Many a times, we may not be able to achieve what we are looking for. Thus, it is highly required that the individual doesn't give up easily. Starting afresh is what that will give an individual renewed strength to face adversities and persevere till the goal is reached. So keep going forward. Knowing the difference between right and wrong. Having the sensitivities to choose between the good and bad. Being courageous for not so good things would not be considered as demonstration of the quality. Therefore, making intelligent decisions is what is also required to be courageous. Going beyond one's comfort zone. Having the potential and strength to innovate, discover, having the zeal to go beyond the status quo, and be ready to have a thrilling, challenging life increases one's courage. Therefore, having the courage to expand one's repertoire of experiences is also desirable. Accepting failures with open arms. Failures are a part of experiencing successes. A courageous man has the strength to bear with any failure that might happen and still be able to persevere and be resilient to face adversities. Accepting it the way it is demonstrates faith in one's capacities that further builds courage. Becoming courageous. Everyone's definition of courage changed with changing situations. The more a person experiences situations in which he would have to choose between being courageous or fearful, more this person would come up with a different definition of courage for himself or herself. Courage is an attribute that is admired, needs to be promoted and fostered in every individual. It has been found that courage is a moral habit and is developed by practice. Courage would develop with successful acts of being courageous. So one can be a vicarious model of his own self, and that gradually build upon the foundation of courage. The experience of courage only comes in when there is the emotion of fear, and it is only when the fear is overcome that the courage comes. For courage, it is important that there is a perceived personal risk, the presence of fear, and an uncertain outcome. Courage is an action that takes place despite the fear, the risk, and the uncertainty. Examples of courageous acts would be starting a new thing, that could be anything from a beginning to do a new course, getting married, having children, moving to a new city, etc. A person who lives an engaging life can be labeled as courageous. He doesn't fear his will to try out new things and is ready to explore. Also, it is important that before acting, one weighs the alternatives and makes a calculated, wise decision. Robert Biswas Diner has recently come up with his book, The Courage Quotient: How Science Can Make You Braver, in 2012. And this book elaborates on how one can manage fear and develop courage. It also has guidelines that give tips on increasing one's strengths and qualities and how one can live a life that is true to oneself, wherein an individual chooses to do what he wants and stands up for what he thinks is the right thing to do. Summary: courage is the ability to act for a meaningful, that is noble, good or practical cause, despite experiencing the fear associated with perceived threat exceeding the available resources. Courage is a value strength that is highly desirable across nations and cultures. However, it hasn't received much attention, due to which there is a paucity of research in this area. Various scholars have deliberated upon the components of courage. It can be said that courage has the components of free choice to accept or not to accept the consequences of acting, risk or danger, a worthy end, and uncertainty of outcome. Most of the time, courage is thought to be physical in nature. However, there are other types of courage too, such as moral, vital, and psychological. The construct of courage is still in its infancy. There are not many scales developed to measure this construct. Also, due to differing dimensions being proposed for courage, there are complications with the measurement of this psychological strength. As courage is a state and not a fixed trait, it can be developed through various steps, such as getting ready for action, being true to one's action, perseverance, making correct choices, experimenting, and accepting failures on the path. The relationship between fear and courage is complex and needs more research. Courage is an action that takes place despite the fear, the risk, and the uncertainty.